So for the next few months, I'll be taking a journey through the book of James. At the beginning, if I liken it to a motorcycle ride, I will be on mountain roads with lots of windy turns and be taking it slowly, just enjoying the ride. But it may get to a point where I get on the highway and move through it more quickly. But at the beginning, my intent is to take it slowly. So for the first 11 verses, I intend to bring 4 messages out of those first 11, and then we'll see if I need to get on the highway or not. I do have a lengthy introduction to the book of James just to give you some background to it, but I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to post it on our website, on our blog, and you can read the introduction, sort of this discussion of who is James. You know, the major consensus is that he is the half-brother of Jesus Christ. You can read that discussion. Who are the 12 tribes scattered abroad? It sounds like they're, the old ancient Israel. But some would argue, and I would agree, that they are Jews that have become Christians who are, in some sense, the new Israel of God. But you can read that sort of discussion about the writer, the recipients, the time of the writing on the blog that will be up sometime early this week. But I really want to get right into the book. If I were to look at the entire book and ask the question, what is it about? I would say something like this: it is the gospel applied, or it's a practical expression of the Christian faith. Or as James says in James chapter 2, faith without works is dead. So it shows us how a living faith in Jesus Christ expresses itself in real life. I find it interesting how he begins the book. If you're familiar with other epistles from Paul, from Peter, normally when they begin, they tell us who they're writing to, and then they give some sort of friendly remarks, salutations. But listen to how James begins. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. It's a striking way to begin. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For the next few weeks, I'm going to talk about having a joyful faith that believes that God is providentially working in your circumstances, in the midst of your trials, a joyful faith. Now, faith in God's providence is difficult enough. Bill Hill talked a little bit about that last week in his message on Hannah. But it's difficult enough for us to believe that God is working in the midst of my very difficult circumstances in life. So faith is a challenge in itself. But we're not called to simply have faith and hold on. We're called to have joyful faith, to count it all joy, or as the NIV says, count it pure joy when you meet trials of various kind. We're going to see in our text tonight that we are called to what I'll call a biblical optimism. Not simply optimism, because optimism at times can be naive and groundless, but a biblical optimism that God is providentially at work in my difficult circumstances in life, and that I can count it pure joy. Now, as I share this text tonight, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to weave it around and into a story that I read this week, an article that I read called "When God Does the Miracle We Didn't Ask For." It's an article written by a woman, Vanitha Rendell. Maybe some of you read it. I believe it was posted on John Piper's site, Desiring God. But listen to her story as I begin tonight. This is how it begins. Countless childhood surgeries, year-long stints in the hospital, verbal and physical bullying from classmates, multiple miscarriages as a young wife, the unexpected death of a child, a debilitating progressive disease, riveting pain, betrayal, a husband who leaves. That's how she begins her story. She says, if it were up to me, I would have written my story differently. Not one of those phrases would be included. Each line represents something hard, gut-wrenching, life-changing. But in retrospect, she says, I wouldn't change a thing. Honestly, it's only in hindsight that I can make such a bold statement. Through all of those devastating events, I begged God to deliver me, to save my baby, to reverse my disease, to bring my husband back. And each time God said no. No was not the answer I wanted. I was looking for miraculous answers to prayer, a return to normalcy, relief from the pain. I wanted the kind of grace that would deliver me from my circumstances. Instead of giving me delivering grace, God gave me sustaining grace. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is how we experience this sustaining grace of God. Really, that's what the first 11 chapters are about, this practical outworking of the gospel in our life that points us to a God in whom we can have a biblical optimism, believing that despite my pain and my suffering and my trials and my heartache, that God is at work in my life. He is refining my character. He is making me into someone that He wants me to become. And my pain and my suffering and my trials are part of that. Among Jews, and I must say that among many Christians today, there was a common belief that to be right with God meant that your life was virtually absent of trials. If you did the right thing, God blessed you with good things. If you suffered trials and troubles and tribulation, then they were a result of your sin, and God was smacking you down, paying you back. Recently, I've read through the book of Job again, not because I felt any particular need in my life to do that, but it was in my read through the Bible reading. So I read through the book of Job again and saw once again how his friends often thought that way. Job, you're suffering. You must have done something really bad in your life. Now, certainly, some of the bad stuff we experience is because of the bad decisions or wrong decisions or foolish decisions we make. But even then, as a Christian, if God is allowing me to suffer the consequences of my foolishness or my lack of wisdom, even then, it's training. It's not judgment. God's not seeking to hurt me. God is seeking to teach me, to help me to grow up. He's not seeking to destroy me. As someone said, God doesn't lead us to deep waters to drown us, but to cleanse us. But the fact is, there is no equation between I do this right and God blesses me this way. I do this wrong and God hurts me in this way. You cannot figure out life that way. We just have to believe that if my life is tough, if I'm going through trial and I belong to God, that a sovereign God is working in my circumstances to develop me as his child, as his son, as his daughter. He is training me. So our text is going to tell us this evening that if we will have this biblical optimism that allows us to experience God's sustaining grace, there's three things we must handle from, let's say, verses 2 through 4 this evening. Three things I want us to think about. One is simply this: accept the reality of trials. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, or as the NIV says, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Listen to Vanitha's words again. Countless childhood surgeries, year-long stints in the hospital, verbal and physical bullying from classmates, multiple miscarriages as a young wife, the unexpected death of a child, a debilitating progressive disease, riveting pain, betrayal, a husband that leaves. These are things that just met her in life. She didn't plan them. She didn't want them. They just met her in life. And this is the way trial often is. Often it's external stuff that is coming to us from the outside and touching us. We'll see in the book of James that James uses two different Greek words that are translated trial, sometimes temptation. They're both used here in the beginning of the book of James. One of them normally speaks of an outward trial that is more of a temptation. That is, it's an outward trial that is meant to destroy you. The other word is used more of an inward trying of your faith. And sometimes they're one and the same thing. Often they're one and the same thing. Often there's this stuff that's happening in your life that has a design to defeat you, to destroy you. But inside, there's this trial, this testing of your faith to see what you really believe, in whom do you really believe, how strongly do you believe that? But the trials are often external. We can't control them. I think of the recipients of this letter. They appear to be Jewish converts who are spread throughout the Roman Empire, who appear to be of the poorer class of people. And so all of this in itself causes difficulty for them. Just being a Jew would be hard enough in the Roman Empire. But being a Jew who's now a Christian not only makes you an object of hatred of those who aren't Christians, it makes you an object of hatred of those who were formerly your brethren, the Jews. On top of that, they are the diaspora. They're the seed that is spread about. They are aliens in the world they're living in. Some of you can identify with that. The difficulty of coming to a country where you don't know anybody, you don't know the culture, you are an outsider, you have a tough time finding a job, just making it in life. Well, this was these people. And it appears that for the most part they're poor, because he says a lot about poverty in this book. They have a tough time. This is life, it's finances, or it's health, or it's work, or it may be circumstances that just touch you because of where you live, or who you live with, or who's around you. Or it may be circumstances that come on you because you are a believer, and there is opposition, and there is betrayal, there is persecution. But all of these things are real. They're external. They're not necessarily any fault of your own. He says you meet them. I think the older translation says you fall into them. It's the same word that's used to describe the man who is taken among thieves, and the Good Samaritan comes along and helps him. It says he fell among thieves. He didn't plan it. He was on his journey, and this bad stuff happened to him. That's the way life is. It's external, often through no fault of our own. Often it comes in a truckload. Your trials are numerous. They're of many kinds. Sometimes there's stuff we can handle on our own, but some things in and of themselves are too big for us. But when you get smacked with one right after the other, you listen to Vanitha's testimony. I mean, this was a truckload of stuff that she fell into that was dumped on her. Her faith is being tried, and it's unexpected. It's not planned for. We don't choose the place, the time of our battles in life. We just need to be ready for them. So what do? We're in the midst of trials that are numerous and unwelcome and unsought and unexpected. What do? Often our first cry is the cry of the psalmist. Why, God? Why me? Or why now? And so we cry out for deliverance. And let me say that deliverance is a legitimate plea to God. Though God will often not give you delivering grace, though he will always give you sustaining grace. Listen again to some of Vanitha's words. She says, at first I rejected God's grace as insufficient. I wanted deliverance. not sustenance. I wanted the pain to stop. I wanted to be held up through the pain. I wanted the pain to stop, not to be held up through the pain. I was just like the children of Israel who rejoiced at God's delivering grace in the parting of the Red Sea, but complained bitterly at his sustaining grace in the provision of manna. With every heartache, I wanted a Red Sea miracle. A miracle that would astonish the world, that would reward me for my faithfulness, make my life glorious. I didn't want manna, but God knew better. Each day he continued to put manna before me. At first I grumbled. It seemed like second best. It wasn't the feast I envisioned. It was bland and monotonous, but after a while, I began to taste the manna, embrace it, and savor its sweetness. We cry for deliverance. We almost demand deliverance. God, look at what I've done for you. And I suspect that there's someone sitting right here tonight, many of us probably, whose load seems unbearable, who's cried out to God like the psalmist, "Why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of my enemy?" And what does God want you to do? He wants you to taste the manna. Embrace it. Savor its sweetness. That there's something in the gospel. Sometimes it's the memory of that grace that forgave us. Sometimes it's the memory of grace where God had delivered us in the past. Sometimes it's the hope of the future when God will pour out such grace that he will wipe away every tear and remove every problem in life. But sometimes it's just in the midst of my pain and my sorrow and my trouble, sometimes it's just the manna, just tasting his grace in the midst of that trial. We need to accept the reality of trial. But secondly, we need to know our responsibilities in trial. There's one thing in these first 3 verses that these believers are told to do. Count it all joy. You say, what? Who wrote this? Pastor Wacko. I'm suffering. Imagine James talking to Vanitha. A child who dies, a husband who leaves, a body filled with pain, disappointment after disappointment, hardship after hardship. And James, the first thing he tells these people is, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kind. In the therapeutic world in which we live, those words are not welcome. Because most people are saying, no, I deserve better than what I have. I don't want to count it joy in the midst of my suffering. I demand deliverance. But James's words tell us that trial as an occasion for joy is at least a possibility. It's an alternative to despair. That maybe what's happening in my life that's brought me sadness is actually a gift from God that brings me closer to Him and gives me a deeper joy that life itself can't give me. I've been reading a book called Good Mood, Bad Mood, written by a doctor, I think he's from Johns Hopkins, but a Christian medical doctor who has dealt with the issues of depression and ailments all of his life. And I think at one point he says, that people who were suffering depression, and not that there isn't a real clinical depression, but he would say that's probably about 10% of people who are depressed. But he says that of those who were given medication for depression, 87% of them improved. Whether that medication was real or a placebo. Because it wasn't the medication so much, it was the hope in the medication. It was the belief that it would do something. And then he has one chapter, the book's worth reading, by the way, called The Gift of Sadness. See, we live in a world where to be sad is to be bad. If I'm sad, then I have the right to be happy. I need to be smiling and bubbly all the time, and just life needs to be perfect. And no, he argues, sadness is a gift that makes us see life at times as it really is and face it with the help of God. It brings us to prayer and a new faith and dependence. There's nothing wrong with most of the sadness that you and I experience. It's just life. It's a gift from God that causes us to turn to Him. But in order for us to be able to find our trials as an occasion for joy, we have to believe that there's a God who really is at work in the midst of my circumstances. If I don't control my mind, and by that I mean keep believing. James tells us we need to control our minds. Gird up the loins of your mind, as the old version says. If I don't keep believing and resting in a God who is sovereign and at work, and believing that even in my circumstances that are difficult, that this is a gift from God that throws me, that causes me to turn back to Him, then I will get in the flesh. And I know what it is to be in the flesh. I know what it is to react. I know what it is to feel like I have a right to something better. I know what it is to feel injustice at times and feel like I ought to fight it. I'm not saying we shouldn't fight injustice, but you shouldn't fight it until first your heart has been humbled beneath the sovereignty of God. Otherwise, you will fight it like a pagan, and you will fight back with a vengeance, and you will do it with anger, and you will do it with a sense of entitlement, and I have the right to this, instead of starting with, in the midst of this pain, God is at work teaching and forming His people, as well as reaching those who don't know Him. Often we're like little children. I watched two of my grandkids yesterday playing around. They had this little ball that sticks to a Velcro, glove, that little game. And it's a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. Is that right? 3-year-old, 2-year-old? 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so the 4-year-old has this little ball, and he drops it. And the 2-year-old so speedy. He shot to that ball, grabbed it, and ran. And the 4-year-old had a fit. Now, if his dad wasn't there, I know what he would have done, because I've seen him do it before. He would grab that little 2-year-old, he would tackle him, he would wrestle him to the ground, he would rip that ball out of his hand because he had the right to do it. And that's how we are. We're 3-year-olds when it comes to trials sometimes. We're 3-year-olds when we're treated wrongly. We're 3-year-olds when life gives us a wrong turn and we react with anger and respond with a demand of our rights instead of falling to our knees and saying, God, yes, this is wrong and it hurts, but you're sovereign. I'm your child. This is touching me for a reason. You're forming me through this. So give me grace to be trained in this and to approach this situation as a grown-up. Because grown-ups shouldn't fight over little plastic balls that stick to Velcro gloves. They shouldn't. Paul says, though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Joy's a possibility. I need to believe that. And in the midst of my pain, I need to grab hold of that joy and then face whatever I need to face with this joyful confidence that God is at work even in my pain. And even if he doesn't overturn the injustice, the wrong, the hurt, the illness, the loss, even though he doesn't give me delivering grace, he'll give me sustaining grace. And sometimes we say, with Paul, who cried 3 times, God, deliver me. And God said, no, I will not deliver you. I will sustain you in the midst of your trouble. Because my strength is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. And then to say with Paul, therefore, I take pleasure in my infirmities, in my weakness, in my illness. For Christ's sake, for when I am weak, I am strong. He counted it all joy, pure joy, to suffer in the will of God. And Peter tells us that over and over again, especially 1 Peter 4. Rejoice, be happy if you're suffering in the will of God. But considering trial as an occasion for joy isn't simply a possibility. It is clearly a Christian responsibility. Notice James doesn't say work up the feeling of joy, feel joyful at the trial. He says consider. Set your mind on what is happening and the God who is sovereign in the midst of it. Consider it as an occasion to rejoice in a sovereign God who's at work in your life. He's not saying rejoice that your husband left or your child died. He's saying rejoice that the suffering that you're experiencing and feeling is under the control of a sovereign God who's at work in your life. It's not beyond his reach or his power. Consider is an appeal to your will. It's a choice that you and I make. Recently, I had a friend of mine, a pastor friend, tell me about how discouraged he was. And I understand it because I've been to the place at times as a pastor when I wanted to quit. And I sensed that's where he was in his life. And so we talked. We texted back and forth. He's out of the state. And it really came down to the discussion, am I willing to suffer for something that I really love? Do I love the church? Do I love the ministry? Do I love the work of God? If so, am I willing to suffer for it? Because our willingness to suffer for something really is a good test of our love and our commitment to love. And people walk away from marriages all the time. Why? Because it's not always rosy. Life isn't perfect. It's painful sometimes. And so you have to say to husbands and wives, are you willing, because you made a vow, you made a commitment, you love your wife, are you willing to bear the pain? How much do you love? You would do it for your children. I hear parents all the time say when their kids are ill, I wish I could suffer for them. I wish I could be in the hospital in their place. They love them. They're willing to suffer. If you love God, you're willing to suffer. If you love your wife, your spouse, your husband, you're willing to suffer in marriage at times. Because God is at work in us, in our pain, as much as He is in the person who may be causing that pain. Listen to Vinitha's as she speaks of her struggle to find joy. She says, at first I just wanted the agony to go away. I don't rejoice in the moment. I don't rejoice at all. But as I cling to God and His promises, He sustains me. Joy is at first elusive. I have glimpses of delight, but it is mostly slow and incremental. Yet over time, I realize I have an inexplicable joy. Not in my circumstances, but in the God who cares so fiercely for me. Eating the everyday bland, sometimes unwelcome manna produces a joy beyond my wildest imaginings. I have found that this joy, which is often birthed out of suffering, can never be taken away. It only gets richer over time. My circumstances cannot diminish it. It produces lasting fruit like endurance and character and hope. It draws me to God in breathtaking ways. It achieves a weight of glory that is beyond all comparison. The third thing we do is we expect good things out of our trials because God is working. He says, consider it an occasion for joy, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Enduring by having a joyful faith in the providence of God, it makes you stronger. It doesn't take away the trial. Joe, I was watching you guys practice when I got there early for Bible study the other night. This was a UPenn wrestling practice. And one of the things they were doing at the end was, I'm not quite sure I saw exactly how you were doing it, but you were sort of laying on your forearms in almost like a push-up position, but you were laying on your forearms and just holding that position. So I tried it a few times. And I could hear your coach yelling, "Hold it! Hold it! Hold it! Hold it! Hold it! Expand that chest! Hold it!" And it seemed like much of their workout was about endurance, enduring pain, being able to hold it. Because that coach knows they're going to get in the midst of a match that will take every bit of their breath and stamina and strength to the point where they feel like, I want to die, I want to quit. But they will muster up the energy, the strength to go on. Steadfastness comes from two words, Greek words that make up one word, which literally means to remain under. We think again of deliverance as getting out of the trouble. That being faithful is being free of trouble. But steadfastness is remaining under. But I want to tweak it a little bit, because it's not just remaining under the trial that is pressing on you and testing your faith in God, but it's remaining under God's sovereignty. It's really not the trial that I'm under, because God is in control of everything that is touching my life. And if it feels like it's crushing me, I will only believe it will crush me if I lose faith in the God who actually holds that in his hands. And it will only crush me if he lets it go and wants it to crush me. God uses trial to increase our staying power, our steadfastness, our faithfulness. And if we keep running from the little ones, we'll never be able to face the big ones, and they come to all of us. He says they help us to grow up, to become mature. Those of you that have kids know that you would like to shield your children from every difficulty in life. Make it as easy as you can for them and not have the pain and the struggles that you had. And part of that is good, but part of that is naive. And part of it is simply wrong. Because you become tough by facing tough things, living in a faith in a God who is in control of life. You become tough by learning how to pray and learning how to wait on God and to lean on God and to trust God and to be patient. This is how you become tough. You don't become tough because somebody's always solving your problem for you and helping you out. No, you become tough because you've learned to be steadfast in your faith, to stay in that trial and not run, but to trust God through it. That helps you to grow up. And he says to become whole in every part, complete in every way. This is God's goal. God's goal is that you and I be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. What does that look like? Well, we have many portraits of that, like the fruit of the Spirit, like 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 12 and following, all of these qualities. Being conformed to Christ. And trial, suffering, difficulty, pain are all ways of bringing into my life the fruit of the Spirit, learning to love, learning to be patient, learning to be temperate, learning to be godly in the midst of difficult times. As Vinitha closed her article, these are her final words. She said, "This manna, this sustaining grace is what upheld me. It revived me when I was weak. It drove me to my knees. And unlike delivering grace, which once received, inadvertently moved me to a greater independence from God, sustaining grace kept me tethered to Him. I needed it every day. Like manna, it was new every morning. God has delivered me and answered some prayers with a resounding yes in jaw-dropping supernatural ways. I look back at them with gratitude and awe. Yet after those prayers were answered, I went back to my everyday life, often less dependent on God. But the answer of no or wait, and those answered by imperceptible degrees over time, have done a far deeper work in my soul. They have kept me connected to the giver and not his gifts. They have forced me to seek him, and in seeking him, I have discovered the intimacy of his fellowship. In the midst of my deepest pain, in the darkness, God's presence has been unmistakable. Through excruciating struggles, he speaks to me. He comforts me through his word. He whispers to me in the dark as I lie awake on my tear-stained pillow. He sings beautiful songs over me in his love. Yes, we face some tough things in life. And it's all right to cry out, God, deliver me. But when you wake up tomorrow morning and it's still there, you need to believe that there's a sovereign God who's working in the midst of your trial for your good and for his glory. And so count it an occasion for joy, because God is doing something new and wonderful in your life. Count it all joy. Let's pray together, shall we? Father, help us to see that our troubles, our trials, are not a call to run, but a call to renewed faith. Father, I pray for those here tonight that are burdened with heavy things. The words of Jesus remain true, not just for those who don't know him, but for those of us who do know him. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Thank you for grace that forgives us. Thank you for grace that sometimes delivers us. Thank you for grace that sustains us. Thank you for Jesus Christ, who died and rose again, who is full of grace and truth, who invites us to come boldly to the throne of grace that we might obtain mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.